Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. March 14, 1978, 9:47 a.m. A service call logged under routine maintenance. Classification would become one of the most quietly significant counterintelligence discoveries of the late Cold War period. Though almost no one outside a restricted circle within the Defense Intelligence Agency would ever know its full scope. The technician who answered that call, a 42-year-old man named Richard Brenner, had spent 18 years servicing photocopiers for Xerox Corporation. He had never been briefed on espionage tradecraft. He had never signed a security clearance document. He had never imagined that the machines he repaired could be weaponized against the country that manufactured them. On that Tuesday morning, adjusting his tool belt in the lobby of a defense contractor's administrative building on the outskirts of the city, he was thinking only about a jammed paper feed and whether he would make it home in time for his daughter's school play. What he discovered inside the Xerox 9200 on the third floor would unravel a Soviet industrial espionage network that had been operating undetected for more than 6 years, harvesting classified technical documents through a method so elegant in its simplicity that Western counterintelligence had never thought to look for it. The machine in question belonged to Cardwell Aerospace Systems, a mid-tier contractor specializing in radar altimeter components for military aircraft. The company occupied 2 floors of a converted textile factory, the kind of repurposed industrial space common in Philadelphia's manufacturing districts. Cardwell's security was competent but not extraordinary. Visitors signed in. Employees wore badges. Classified materials were kept in locked cabinets. The Xerox 9200, purchased in 1975, sat in a common area used by engineering staff to duplicate technical drawings, procurement forms, and occasionally, documents stamped with classification markings that should never have left the vault, but did anyway, because deadlines were tight and engineers were human. No one had ever questioned the machine itself. It was furniture. It was infrastructure. It hummed and clicked and produced copies, and when it jammed, someone called Xerox, and a technician arrived, and the world continued exactly as before. Brenner had serviced this particular machine 4 times in the past 2 years. He knew its quirks. The model was notorious for drum failures and toner leaks, problems Xerox had addressed in later iterations, but which plagued the 9200 throughout its production run. When he arrived that morning, the office manager, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain, described the issue with the weary precision of someone who had made this call too many times. The machine was producing double images. Faint ghost copies appeared beneath the primary print. Brenner nodded. He had seen this before. Usually it meant the corona wires needed cleaning or the drum had developed a charge imbalance. Routine work. 30 minutes, maybe 45 if you found corrosion. He opened the machine's side panel and began the standard diagnostic sequence. The Xerox 9200 was a beast of a device, over 6 feet long and weighing nearly 800 pounds. Its internal architecture was a labyrinth of rollers, lamps, mirrors, and selenium-coated drums. Brenner worked methodically, checking voltages, inspecting the fuser assembly, examining the optical path. Everything appeared normal. He moved to the drum assembly, tilting his head to get a better angle on the corona wire housing, and that was when he saw it. A small metal box, roughly the size of a cigarette pack, mounted to the interior frame with machine screws. It was connected to the photoreceptor circuit by 2 thin wires, red and black, soldered with professional precision. The box was not part of the original design. Brenner had rebuilt dozens of 9200s. He knew every component, every subassembly, every manufacturer part number. This device had no business being there. His first thought was that another technician had installed some kind of diagnostic module or upgrade kit without logging it in the service record. Irritating, but not unheard of. He reached for his flashlight to get a closer look at the wiring. The box was made of brushed aluminum, featureless except for a small ventilation grill on one side. No manufacturer markings. No serial number, no Xerox logo. Brenner felt the first cold thread of unease move through his stomach. He traced the wires back to their connection points. They were tapped directly into the optical sensor array, the part of the machine that read the document being copied. Whoever installed this had intimate knowledge of the 9200 schematic. This was not amateur work. Brenner stepped back from the machine. The office around him continued its normal rhythm. Telephones rang. A secretary walked past carrying a stack of folders. Somewhere down the hall, a man laughed at something a colleague had said. Brenner's hands were steady, but his mind was accelerating through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He considered simply removing the device and saying nothing. He considered calling his supervisor at Xerox and asking for guidance. He considered the fact that this was a defense contractor, that the machine copied documents related to military aircraft, and that the small aluminum box with no markings was hidden in a place where no one would ever see it unless they knew exactly where to look. He made his decision in less than 30 seconds. He closed the side panel without touching the device again, packed his tools, and walked calmly to the office manager's desk. He told her the problem was more complex than he had initially assessed and that he needed to consult with a senior engineer before proceeding. She seemed annoyed but unsurprised. He asked if there was a phone he could use privately. She directed him to a small conference room. Brenner closed the door, picked up the receiver, and dialed not his supervisor at Xerox, but a number he had memorized years earlier during a brief stint as a Navy electronics technician, a number he had never expected to use. It connected him to the Philadelphia field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The context in which this discovery occurred cannot be understood without recognizing the state of Soviet industrial espionage operations in the mid to late 1970s. By this point in the Cold War, the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union had evolved far beyond the dramatic defections and dead drops of the immediate post-war period. The intelligence services of both superpowers had professionalized, bureaucratized, and adapted to an era in which technological superiority often mattered more than ideological conversion. The KGB's Directorate T, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence, had shifted focus from recruiting ideologically motivated sources to cultivating access through more pragmatic means. Money, blackmail, and appeals to ethnic loyalty replaced appeals to communist doctrine. More significantly, Directorate T had begun exploring methods that reduced reliance on human agents altogether. The logic was straightforward. Human sources were vulnerable, unpredictable, and difficult to control. They developed consciences. They made mistakes. They got arrested. A device, properly designed and covertly installed, had none of these liabilities. It operated continuously, without fear or hesitation, transmitting or storing information until physically discovered or rendered inoperable. The technical challenge was substantial, but not insurmountable. By 1975, Soviet engineers had developed miniaturized recording systems, photographic devices triggered by specific electronic signals, and passive collection mechanisms that required no external power source. What they needed was access, the kind of access that would allow installation without arousing suspicion. The solution they found was elegant in its indirectness. Rather than attempting to penetrate secure facilities directly, they targeted the infrastructure those facilities depended on. Photocopiers, for instance, were ubiquitous in corporate and government environments. They were serviced regularly by outside contractors. They were large, complex machines with internal spaces that could conceal small devices. Most importantly, they were trusted. No one suspected a photocopier. It was a tool, not a threat. Between 1973 and 1978, at least 17 Xerox machines sold to defense contractors. Aerospace firms and technology companies on the East Coast were modified during manufacturing or servicing to include clandestine imaging systems. The operation was run by the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, in coordination with a network of embedded agents working within supply chains, manufacturing facilities, and service companies. The devices themselves were marvels of compact engineering. Each unit contained a miniaturized camera synchronized to the machine's optical system, a small reservoir of high-speed film, and a mechanical counter that tracked the number of documents copied. When the counter reached a predetermined threshold, typically 500 exposures, the device locked itself and awaited retrieval. The retrieval mechanism was simple. A GRU officer, posing as a service technician or quality control inspector, would arrive at the facility on some plausible pretext, access the machine, remove the exposed film cartridge, and replace it with a fresh one. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. The film was then couriered through diplomatic channels to Moscow, where it was developed and analyzed by specialists in Directorate T. The companies being targeted had no idea they were hemorrhaging proprietary information. The FBI, despite extensive counterintelligence efforts, had no framework for detecting this kind of operation because they were looking for people, not machines. Richard Brenner did not know any of this when he made his phone call. He knew only that something was wrong, that the wrongness had the texture of deliberate concealment, and that his instinct, honed over years of troubleshooting mechanical systems, told him to stop and report rather than proceed and discover. The FBI agent who took his call, a man named David Kowalski, was initially skeptical. The Bureau received hundreds of tips every month from concerned citizens who had seen something unusual and assumed the worst. Most led nowhere. But Kowalski was also experienced enough to recognize that Brenner's tone, calm and factual, lacked the breathless urgency of a crank. When Brenner described the device in technical detail, specifying the gauge of the wires and the precision of the soldering, Kowalski made a note and said he would send someone to take a look. 2 hours later, 3 men arrived at Cardwell Aerospace Systems. They identified themselves as representatives from Xerox corporate headquarters conducting a quality assurance audit. The office manager found this odd, given that Brenner had just been there, but she had no grounds to refuse them access. The men, in fact, were FBI technical specialists accompanied by a case officer from the agency's counterintelligence division. They examined the device under Brenner's guidance, photographed it from multiple angles, and carefully extracted it from the machine without disturbing the internal film cartridge. By late afternoon, the device was in a laboratory in Washington, D.C., being disassembled under controlled conditions. What they found confirmed Brenner's suspicion and exceeded it in scope. The camera had captured 473 documents. When the film was developed, analysts discovered technical schematics for radar altimeters, classified performance specifications, and procurement correspondence containing information about future defense contracts. The implications were immediate and severe. Within 48 hours, a joint task force was established involving the FBI, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agency's Signals Intelligence Division. Their mandate was to determine the scale of the operation, identify all compromised machines, and trace the network responsible for the installations. The initial investigation focused on Xerox's service records. Every machine sold to a defense-related entity in the past 5 years was flagged for inspection. Technicians were dispatched to facilities across the Mid-Atlantic region with instructions to conduct what were described as mandatory safety inspections. The inspections were carried out quietly, without informing the companies of the true reason. Within 2 weeks, investigators had identified 9 additional machines containing similar devices. The geographic pattern was revealing. All of the compromised machines were located within a 200-mile radius of Philadelphia. All had been serviced at least once by technicians employed by a subcontractor used by Xerox during periods of high demand. The subcontractor, a firm called Allied Office Equipment Services, had been in operation since 1971. It employed 14 technicians, most of them trained by Xerox and certified to perform warranty work. On paper, the company appeared legitimate. It paid taxes. It maintained liability insurance. It had a small office in South Philadelphia and a warehouse where it stored parts and refurbished equipment. The owner, a man named Peter Rostov, was a naturalized U.S. citizen who had emigrated from East Germany in 1968. His background check, conducted when he applied for his business license, had revealed nothing suspicious. He had no criminal record. He had no known ties to communist organizations. He was, by all appearances, exactly what he claimed to be, a small business owner capitalizing on the growing demand for office equipment maintenance. The FBI began surveillance on Allied Office Equipment Services on March 29, 1978. They tapped the company's phone lines, monitored its financial transactions, and followed its technicians as they made service calls. What they observed was a picture of routine commercial activity, with one exception. Twice a month, on Tuesdays, Peter Rostov drove to a warehouse district near the Delaware River and entered a building owned by a front company registered in Delaware. The building ostensibly housed a small import-export business specializing in machine tools. Surveillance teams noted that Rostov always arrived alone, stayed for approximately 20 minutes, and left carrying a small briefcase he had not brought with him. The briefcase was never the same one twice. A decision was made to enter the warehouse covertly and determine what Rostov was collecting. The operation was conducted on April 12th, during the early morning hours when the building was unoccupied. What the entry team found was a workspace equipped with precision tools, photographic development equipment, and a locked cabinet containing 37 film cartridges, each labeled with a numerical code. The film was seized and analyzed. The cartridges contained thousands of images, technical drawings, classified memos, and procurement documents from at least 12 different companies. The scope of the breach was staggering. For more than 5 years, Soviet intelligence had been systematically harvesting American technological secrets through a method so simple it had been invisible. The question now was how to respond. Arresting Rostov immediately would shut down the operation but might not reveal the full extent of the network. GRU officers were trained to compartmentalize. Rostov likely knew only his handlers and perhaps 1 or 2 other operational assets. The decision was made to let the operation continue under controlled conditions. The FBI replaced the film cartridges in the warehouse with identical duplicates containing carefully curated misinformation. Technical documents that appeared legitimate but contained subtle errors designed to mislead Soviet engineers. Meanwhile, investigators focused on identifying Rostov's contacts. Phone records showed regular calls to a number in New York registered to an import company. Physical surveillance identified a man who met with Rostov twice in public locations, a cafe in Center City and a park near the Schuylkill River. The man was subsequently identified as Viktor Kasparov, a consular officer at the Soviet mission to the United Nations. An individual already suspected of intelligence activities but never conclusively tied to an operation. Richard Brenner, for his part, was debriefed extensively and asked to continue his normal work routine as if nothing had happened. The FBI emphasized that his cooperation had been invaluable and that his discretion was essential. They told him very little about what they had found, only that his instincts had been correct and that he had helped uncover something significant. Brenner asked no questions. He returned to work, servicing copiers, clearing paper jams, replacing toner cartridges. His life resumed its familiar patterns. His daughter's school play went well. His wife noticed he seemed distracted for a few weeks but assumed it was work stress. He never told her what he had discovered. He never told anyone. The weight of the secret settled into him like sediment, a quiet heaviness he carried without complaint. By summer, the counterintelligence operation had expanded to involve assets in 3 countries. British intelligence confirmed that similar devices had been found in Xerox machines serviced in the United Kingdom. West German authorities reported suspicious activity involving office equipment suppliers near U.S. military installations. The operation, it became clear, was not limited to the United States. It was a coordinated effort spanning NATO member states, designed to collect technical intelligence on a scale that would have required hundreds of human agents to accomplish. The efficiency was remarkable, the audacity was breathtaking, and the fact that it had gone undetected for so long was a damning indictment of Western counterintelligence assumptions. The institutional response to what came to be known internally as Operation Paper Trail reflected the peculiar bureaucratic paralysis that often characterized Cold War counterintelligence when faced with unprecedented methodologies. The Defense Intelligence Agency convened a restricted working group in late April 1978, codenamed Cedar Lens, tasked with assessing the damage and formulating a containment strategy. The group's initial report, classified at a level requiring presidential briefing, concluded that the Soviet operation had successfully acquired technical specifications valued conservatively at $800 million in research and development costs. This figure represented not the market value of the information, but the investment required to produce it independently. The implications for strategic parity were significant but not catastrophic. Soviet engineers, the report noted, still lacked the manufacturing precision and materials science capabilities to replicate many American systems even with complete documentation. The greater concern was that the operation revealed a vulnerability so fundamental that its exploitation could be assumed across dozens of other technical domains. The working group's recommendations were implemented with surgical precision and absolute secrecy. Every photocopier, every piece of office equipment capable of image capture or data transmission, installed in facilities handling classified or proprietary information, was to be inspected by cleared personnel using newly developed detection protocols. The inspections were described to facility managers as part of an electromagnetic interference reduction program, a plausible cover given contemporaneous concerns about electronic eavesdropping. Over the course of 6 months, more than 3,000 machines were examined. 41 were found to contain surveillance devices of varying sophistication. The geographic distribution suggested multiple installation vectors. Some devices had been introduced during manufacturing, others during servicing, and a disturbing number appeared to have been installed by individuals with legitimate access to secure facilities, suggesting the existence of embedded agents within the workforce itself. Peter Rostov was arrested on June 3, 1978, not in a dramatic raid, but in a carefully choreographed operation designed to appear routine. He was stopped for a traffic violation while driving near his warehouse. During the subsequent search, ostensibly conducted because of outstanding parking tickets, agents discovered film cartridges hidden in a compartment beneath the vehicle's rear seat. Rostov was taken into custody and held without bail on charges of espionage. His arraignment was closed to the public. The indictment was sealed. Even the existence of the case was classified under provisions of the Espionage Act that permitted such restrictions when disclosure might compromise ongoing operations. Rostov's attorney, a public defender assigned to the case, was granted security clearance sufficient to review the evidence against his client, but was prohibited from discussing it outside designated facilities. The interrogation of Peter Rostov lasted 3 weeks and yielded less than investigators had hoped. Rostov, it became apparent, had been trained in resistance techniques consistent with GO-PRU protocols. He confirmed his identity and his role in servicing office equipment. He admitted to being a Soviet intelligence asset. He refused to identify his handlers or provide details about the operational structure beyond what investigators already knew. His cooperation extended only to technical matters: the specifications of the devices, the methods of installation, the procedures for film retrieval. On questions of personnel and network architecture, he remained silent. The silence was not defiant. It was methodical, disciplined, and reflected a degree of tradecraft that suggested extensive preparation for the possibility of capture. Federal prosecutors faced a dilemma. A public trial would expose the operation's methodology and potentially compromise other ongoing investigations. It would also reveal to the Soviets exactly what had been discovered, and how, allowing them to adjust their techniques accordingly. A plea agreement was reached in August. Rostov agreed to a 40-year sentence in exchange for detailed technical debriefings and a commitment not to contest the charges. The agreement was approved by a judge in a closed hearing. No media coverage was permitted. No record of the case appeared in public court filings. Peter Rostov was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, where he was held in administrative segregation, isolated from the general prison population. He would spend the next 11 years in that facility, speaking to almost no one except intelligence officers conducting periodic debriefings, before dying of a myocardial infarction in 1989, 3 months before the Berlin Wall fell. Viktor Kasparov, the consular officer identified as Rostov's handler, was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States in July 1978. The official reason given was conduct incompatible with his diplomatic status. The standard formula used for intelligence officers caught engaging in espionage. Kasparov departed without incident. No charges were filed. The Soviet government issued a pro form, a denial, and expelled 2 American diplomats from Moscow in retaliation. The exchange was noted in a brief State Department press release and received minimal media attention. The operation itself was never publicly acknowledged. To this day, no comprehensive account of Operation Paper Trail exists in declassified form. What is known comes from fragments. Redacted documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests decades later, and the occasional oblique reference in memoirs written by intelligence officers long after their retirement. Richard Brenner received a letter of commendation from the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, delivered by courier to his home in September 1978. The letter thanked him for his service to national security and noted that his actions had contributed significantly to the protection of classified information. It was signed personally and included a notation that the matter was to be considered permanently classified. Brenner read the letter once, placed it in a drawer, and never mentioned it to anyone. The FBI offered him financial compensation, a standard practice in cases involving civilian cooperation in counterintelligence matters. He declined. When asked why, he told the agent handling his debriefing that he had simply done what seemed necessary. The agent noted in his report that Brenner appeared uncomfortable with the attention and eager to return to normal life. Normal life, however, proved more elusive than Brenner anticipated. The knowledge of what he had discovered, and the larger operation it had revealed, created a persistent sense of unease that he found difficult to articulate even to himself. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked. The small inconsistencies in service records. The machines that seemed to malfunction more frequently than statistical probability would suggest. The technicians he did not recognize appearing at facilities he serviced regularly. He understood intellectually that these observations were likely meaningless, products of heightened awareness rather than genuine anomalies, but the understanding did not diminish the vigilance. He found himself inspecting every machine more carefully, documenting irregularities that probably meant nothing, maintaining a personal log of service calls that went beyond what his employer required. His colleagues noticed the change. Brenner had always been meticulous, but now he was obsessive. He took longer on service calls. He asked more questions. He insisted on examining components that had nothing to do with the reported problems. When asked about it, he offered vague explanations about preventive maintenance and quality control. His supervisor at Xerox received occasional complaints from clients who felt Brenner was wasting time. The supervisor, who knew nothing about Brenner's role in uncovering the espionage operation, counseled him to work more efficiently. Brenner nodded and agreed and continued exactly as before. The tension between his private knowledge and his public obligations created a kind of low-grade anxiety that he managed by retreating into routine, into the familiar rhythms of diagnosis and repair that had defined his professional life for nearly 2 decades. By 1980, the immediate crisis had passed. The compromised machines had been removed or rendered inoperable. The GRU network responsible for the installations had been disrupted, though not entirely dismantled. Soviet intelligence adapted, as it always did, shifting to different methodologies and different targets. The lessons learned from Operation Paper Trail informed new security protocols, new inspection regimes, new awareness training for personnel working with sensitive information. The operation became a case study used in classified briefings, a cautionary example of how adversaries could exploit trusted infrastructure. The individuals involved, Rostov, Kasparov, the technicians who had unknowingly serviced compromised machines, faded into the bureaucratic memory of agencies that documented everything and forgot nothing. Richard Brenner continued working for Xerox until 1991, when the company restructured its service division and offered early retirement packages to senior technicians. He accepted the package without hesitation. He was 55 years old. His daughter had graduated from college and was working as a civil engineer in Pittsburgh. His wife had begun talking about moving somewhere warmer, perhaps North Carolina or Tennessee, places where winters were less punishing and life moved at a gentler pace. Brenner had no objections. He was tired, not physically, but in some deeper way that rest did not alleviate. He wanted distance from machines, from the endless cycle of malfunction and repair, from the knowledge that objects could be turned into instruments of betrayal. They moved to Asheville in 1992. Brenner took up woodworking, a hobby he had abandoned in his 20s when work and family consumed his time. He built furniture, simple pieces initially, then more complex designs as his skills returned. He found satisfaction in the tactile clarity of wood and tools, in creating objects whose purposes were transparent and benign. He avoided electronics. He owned no computer. When photocopiers appeared in the library where he occasionally volunteered, he felt a reflexive wariness that he recognized as irrational but could not entirely suppress. He never told his wife why. She assumed it was simply the aversion of a retired technician who had spent too many years fixing broken machines. In 1997, a journalist researching Cold War espionage contacted Brenner after obtaining a heavily redacted FBI document that mentioned his name in connection with a classified counterintelligence operation. The journalist wanted to interview him, to understand what he had discovered and how it had affected him. Brenner declined politely but firmly. He had nothing to say. The journalist persisted, sending letters, leaving voicemail messages, appealing to Brenner's sense of historical importance. Brenner finally agreed to meet, not to provide information but to explain why he would not. They met in a coffee shop in downtown Asheville. The journalist, a man in his 30s with enthusiasm that Brenner found exhausting, pressed for details. Brenner told him only that he had found something unusual, that he had reported it, and that others had handled the matter from there. When asked how it felt to have uncovered a major espionage operation, Brenner considered the question seriously before answering. He said it felt like discovering a crack in a foundation that everyone assumed was solid, and realizing that cracks were everywhere if you knew where to look. The journalist asked if he could quote that. Brenner shrugged. The quote never appeared in print. The article, when published, mentioned Operation Paper Trail only in passing, a footnote to a larger narrative about Soviet industrial espionage. Brenner was not named. He died in 2006 at the age of 70 from complications related to emphysema. His obituary in the Asheville Citizen-Times described him as a retired Xerox technician who enjoyed woodworking and spending time with his family. There was no mention of his role in counterintelligence history. His daughter, sorting through his belongings after the funeral, found the letter of commendation from the FBI in a drawer beneath old tax returns and instruction manuals for tools he no longer owned. She read it with confusion, then astonishment, then a kind of muted pride that her father had never sought recognition for something clearly significant. She contacted the FBI to ask if the matter could now be discussed publicly. She was told that the classification remained in effect and that no additional information could be released. She accepted this without argument. She kept the letter. The broader implications of Operation Paper Trail extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The operation demonstrated that the Cold War's most effective espionage often occurred not through dramatic defections or elaborate dead drops, but through the patient exploitation of mundane infrastructure. Photocopiers, telephones, mail systems, delivery networks, all the ordinary mechanisms that facilitated commerce and communication could be repurposed as instruments of intelligence collection. The revelation forced a fundamental reassessment of security doctrine. Trust could no longer be assumed. Every device, every system, every point of interface between classified information and the external world had to be examined as a potential vulnerability. This reassessment came at a cost. Security measures proliferated. Inspection regimes became more invasive. The circle of individuals granted access to sensitive information contracted. Efficiency suffered. Innovation slowed. The very openness that had driven American technological advancement became a liability in an environment where adversaries could exploit that openness without restraint. The irony was not lost on those who understood the trade-offs. In protecting secrets, institutions often strangled the collaboration and information exchange that generated those secrets in the first place. The balance between security and productivity remained elusive, a problem that defied neat solutions and persisted long after the Cold War ended. For the men and women who worked in intelligence and counterintelligence during this period, Operation Paper Trail represented both a success and a failure. Success in that the operation was ultimately discovered and disrupted. Failure in that it had operated undetected for years, compromising vast amounts of sensitive information before anyone thought to question whether a photocopier could be more than it appeared. The lesson, repeated in classified briefings and training sessions for years afterward, was that assumptions about what constituted a threat were often the greatest vulnerability. Adversaries succeeded not by overcoming defenses, but by attacking where no defenses existed, exploiting blind spots created by familiarity and routine. The story of Richard Brenner, insofar as it can be reconstructed from fragmentary records and the memories of those who knew him, is the story of an ordinary man who happened to be in the right place with the right knowledge at the right moment. His contribution was not heroic in any conventional sense. He did not risk his life. He did not make dramatic sacrifices. He simply noticed something wrong and chose to report it rather than ignore it. That choice, mundane as it seemed, altered the course of a counterintelligence operation and prevented the continued hemorrhaging of classified information. Yet Brenner received no public recognition, no ceremony, no monument. He lived quietly and died quietly, his role in history known to a handful of people bound by classification restrictions that outlived him. If there is a lesson in his story, it is perhaps this: the Cold War was not won or lost in grand confrontations, but in countless small decisions made by individuals who understood that integrity sometimes meant doing the inconvenient thing, the thing that complicated life, the thing that brought no reward except the knowledge that it was necessary. Brenner made such a decision in a photocopier repair shop in Philadelphia in 1978, and the world continued turning, slightly more secure for his having been there. That he asked for nothing in return, that he carried the weight of classified knowledge without complaint, that he chose obscurity over recognition, makes his contribution no less significant. It makes it, perhaps, more so. These are not just stories. They are warnings. They are reminders that vigilance is not paranoia, that trust must be earned continually, and that the price of security is often paid by those who will never be thanked. If this account troubles you, if it suggests that the world operates with more deception and less transparency than comfortable narratives would suggest, then it has served its purpose. The archives are full of such stories. Most will never be told. Consider that when you encounter the ordinary objects and systems you trust without question, consider what they might conceal, and remember that someone, somewhere, is always looking for the cracks in foundations everyone assumes are solid.